Dobroveče svima, dobrodošli na predavanje profesora Raymonda Geussa. Ja ću sada predstaviti profesora Geussa na engleskom. Raymond Geuss is a world-renowned political philosopher and professor emeritus in the Faculty of Philosophy, University of Cambridge. His research encompasses political philosophy, critical theory, ethics, and the history of European continental philosophy of the 19th and 20th century, and he is considered to be one of the most influential representatives of the school of political realism in contemporary Anglophone political philosophy. Raymond Geuss was born in 1946 in Evansville, Indiana, USA, and he subsequently attended a Catholic high school in Philadelphia established by Hungarian Catholic priests who fled to the United States after the 1956 uprising in Hungary. He took both his undergraduate degree and his PhD from Columbia University, and he has subsequently taught at numerous universities, at Columbia University, at Princeton, and University of Chicago, as well as the universities of Heidelberg and Freiburg in Germany. So his first lecturing position was actually in Heidelberg, as far as I understand. And so he describes his academic trajectory as peripatetic in this sense. Since 1993, Professor Geuss has taught at Cambridge University, first in the Faculty of Social and Political Sciences, and then in philosophy, where he has supervised the graduate work of several prominent scholars working in the history of continental philosophy. Since 2011, he has been a fellow of the British Academy. Professor Geuss has authored a number of books and collections of essays, such as The Idea of a Critical Theory in 1981, Morality, Culture and History in 1999, Parrots, Poets, Philosophers and Good Advice 1999, At Cross Purposes 2001, History and Illusion in Politics 2001, Public Goods, Private Goods 2001, Glück und Politik 2004, Outside Ethics 2005, Philosophy and Real Politics 2008, Politics and the Imagination 2010, and the most recent, A World Without Why 2014. Raymond Geuss is considered to be one of the best authors of philosophical essays in the English-speaking world, for example by Alasdair MacIntyre. He has also co-edited two critical editions of works of Nietzsche, The Birth of Tragedy and Writings from the Early Notebooks. Together with Quentin Skinner, Raymond Geuss co-edits the Cambridge Texts in the History of Political Thought series of books. Geuss has also published two collections of translations, adaptations of poetry from ancient Greek, Latin, and Old High German texts. Let me just briefly mention here that we are especially pleased to welcome Raymond Geuss in Belgrade today due to the fact that he had already visited Belgrade several times earlier, including a brief stay in 1986, exactly 30 years ago. On that particular occasion, as Professor Geuss mentions in the preface to the work Public Goods, Private Goods, his entire manuscript, an entire folder full of texts, which would later become the book in 2001, 15 years later, was stolen from his room in Hotel Park in Belgrade. So we are also very much looking forward to leaving Professor Geuss with a somewhat better impression of Belgrade this time. Today's lecture on the concept of utopia is devoted to the theme of utopian thought, more precisely its place and importance for us today. As you'll see, Geuss's perspective on what form utopian thought should assume, as well as on its influence on action, differs significantly from most conventional uses of the term utopia. Much of Geuss's recent work revolves around the question of compatibility between what he terms the realist approach to explaining political and social reality, which, as you will see, has nothing to do with the term realism, classical use of the term realism in epistemology, on the one hand, so realism on the one hand, and the striving for the impossible, which one might also call utopianism or utopian thought, on the other. Now, to put it in a nutshell, realism for Raymond Geuss means that our judgment is always context-dependent, and that political theory is not, or that it should not be, applied ethics. It cannot consist simply in envisaging a comprehensive picture of the good society in abstraction and then projecting it onto social reality. Realism is in this sense above all opposed to moralism, a perspective which attempts to explain political phenomena exclusively through recourse to social actors' normative action orientations. In this respect, Geuss is strongly critical of most of the liberal tradition in political philosophy, especially Rawlsianism, which he sees as this contextually insensitive, ethics-first approach to politics. As Geuss identifies with the Hegelian tradition in broadest terms, he is more generally critical of the entire Kantian tradition in practical philosophy. But where do we find the intrinsic link between realism, in the sense of context-sensitive and non-moralist explanation and judgment on political phenomena, and utopianism? Well, Geuss above all argues in many of his works that volitional processes, that means processes such as wishing and desiring, are indispensable and moreover desirable aspects of practical philosophical and abstract thought in general. He argues, for example, that our natural inclinations to exaggerate things in everyday speech is an extremely important component of all abstract thought. As Geuss also works within the paradigm of critical theory, I believe one could also express this insight in terms of the intrinsic link between the explanatory and the emancipatory strivings within our thought processes. Geuss insists that political worldviews, in particular political ideologies, are not free-floating sets of ideas. They are inherently related to practice in complex ways, and as such they cannot and should not be held to the same standard of absolute coherence and comprehensiveness as closed theoretical system devised within the narrow confines of the academia. And in this respect, in today's lecture, Raymond Geuss will talk, among other, about the possibility of what one might call a dynamic or an open-ended form of utopian thought. So without further ado, I give the word to Professor Geuss.
Thank you very much. I would very much have liked to be able to give this talk in Serbian, but I'm afraid I can't. Nevertheless, I'd like to mention that I'm fully aware of the fact that this is an artificial, asymmetrical situation, one in which I'm allowed to speak in my native language, and you have to listen to me in what is, for most of you, I take it, a foreign language. And I am fully sensible of the fact that that's a privilege you have granted me, and you're doing me a favor by permitting that. So thank you very much for that, and thank you for inviting me to Belgrade. Utopia, as is well known, is the title of a small work written in Latin by the humanist Thomas Morus and modeled on the dialogues of Plato and Cicero. It first appeared in print in 1516 in Leuven, in the Netherlands. The central section of the text is a long description of the customs and manners of the inhabitants of a purportedly newly found island, namely the island of Utopia. The political institutions and the social structure of Utopia are said to be completely different from those of any known 16th century European society. Most importantly, the utopians have no private property. The word utopia is a neologism coined by Morus. It derives from the conjunction of two Greek elements, a modal adverb of negation, ou, and the substantive topos, meaning place or position or site. Morus himself glosses it appropriately in Latin in a letter to his fellow humanist Erasmus as nusquama, the land no place. There are, however, in ancient Greek a number of perfectly normal words for nowhere. For instance, udame, udamos, or udototi. And some later writers, including Rabelais, notably, formed terms to refer to non-existing societies by starting with one or another of these everyday words for nowhere. So why did Morus not use one of the everyday words for nowhere? Why did he make up his own? The fact that Morus does not use one of the everyday words, but invents his own word, suggests to me very strongly that he wishes to emphasize the component topos, place, in his formulation. But why would he want to do that? My strong suspicion is that the reason for this is that topos has a normal geographic sense, but it also is intended to have a strong metaphorical sense. To speak of a place is to speak of an organized society with a structure we can recognize. In ancient rhetoric, topos can also mean a commonplace saying, an everyday saying, or a familiar expression used in a conventional way. So Utopia is not just a country that happens not to be on any map, not to be anywhere, but it's also not a country, it's also a country that has a structure which we cannot easily recognize as familiar. It's a place where our everyday knowledge and assumptions do not apply. Our everyday assumptions being that private property, for example, is necessary for social stability. So we have two different senses of utopia already. Namely, utopia is that which doesn't exist, and utopia is that which is radically different from what we assume to be the case, and which we therefore cannot recognize as at all familiar. A poem added to the preliminary material of the second edition of Utopia, which appeared in 1517, makes reference to a further ambiguity, which was certainly intended. The first syllable of the word utopia in Latin, ou, can represent the Greek diphthong ou, not, as I mentioned above. But it could also stand for a completely different Greek sound, eu, good. So the land that is completely different from ours, that stands orthogonal to our usual conceptions, and has no location on our maps, is also one that is especially good. And I don't know whether you got the handout. I made a handout which has this little poem on it, which says, I used to be called No Place because I was so infrequently visited, but now I can compete with Plato's Republic, and perhaps even surpass it, because I'm better in all things that are attributed to the Republic in words, but in which I actually excel, because I have the best men, the best resources, and the best laws. So I should be called Good Place. I've merited that name. So Utopia as nowhere, Utopia as a place that contravenes our normal expectations, and Utopia as an especially good place. The description of the island of Utopia in the dialogue has some strong similarities in its literary form with the reports of 16th century seafarers, explorers, and conquistadores about newly found lands and societies outside Europe. In the ethnographic literature, researchers often speak of the ethnographic present, which refers to the tendency one can find, especially in the older ethnographic literature, to underplay the historical dimension of the societies being described and observed. The ethnographer, that is, often speaks as if the society in question had no history or had no relevant history, as if it had always existed in the form which presents itself to him or to her in the present. This flattening out of the temporal dimension into a kind of timeless present has its pendant in a kind of quasi-spatial assumption, namely that there's a single privileged point of view from which the society as a whole can be surveyed. The task of the ethnographer, then, is to find this standpoint and occupy it. One might associate this with various neo-Kantian motifs. If, one might argue, there can be such a thing as proper knowledge of some domain of potential research, there must be such a privileged epistemic point. Because if no such point existed, how could any purported form of ethnographic knowledge actually have the properties of completeness and closedness which we assume forms of knowledge must have? If the ethnographer wishes really to lay claim to knowledge of society, he must also claim to have found and occupied that privileged point of view. He must, that is, be like the master of the house who comes back unexpectedly from a trip and is able to see immediately everything that's happened, or like the colonial administrator who is able to get a quick overview even if he is new to the colony. Now, what sort of society, though, would respond to epistemic demands like this, the demands for easy surveyability from a single privileged epistemic point of view? The kind of society that's easiest to survey at a glance would be one that had been set up according to a unitary plan, precisely for that purpose, such as penal colonies, monasteries, boarding schools, or what used to be called, following Erwin Goffman, total institutions. A utopian author can find it easy to slip into the role of a purportedly omniscient observer, from which it can sometimes be only a small step to becoming, when circumstances permit, someone trying to be a universal administrator. This brings us to a fourth possible characteristic of utopian thinking. It refers to a way of trying to see society as a totality from a unitary standpoint, or looking at society as if it emerged as the result of a unitary plan. Plato's Republic provides perhaps the most famous example of a society entirely constructed according to a single plan. The plan there is to produce the best city, the best society possible, one that is the epitome of what a good society is and can be. Moros himself cites Plato's Republic as a precursor of his island society. However, he distances himself from Plato by insisting that his island society really exists, although it is not on any map, whereas Plato's is constructed merely in words. The philosophical architects of Plato's city start from a number of assumptions about human beings and the societies they can form, and they agree from the beginning on some clear basic principles that will guide them in the construction. The basis from which they begin includes assumptions about the basic goals of human societies and an analysis of the structure of human needs. Am I speaking too quickly for you? Societies, so they talk about basic goals of human societies and the structures of human needs. Societies, they assume, exist for the purpose of satisfying human needs, and we can know with some degree of security which needs are real, genuine, and urgent, and which are false, illusory, superfluous, or perverted. Real needs are, among other things, easily recognized, historically and sociologically invariant, and uncontroversial. The need for nourishment, for clothing, for protection against inclement weather. Anything that goes beyond this, complicated dishes, ornaments, perfume, etc., is really not a necessity of life, but it's a luxury at best. So Plato asks the question now, how can we ensure that all the genuine needs of the members of society are satisfied, even if this requires one to neglect certain artificial and illusory needs? His answer is that the best way to ensure that this takes place is to see that there is a fixed occupation which is specifically directed at satisfying each of the real needs, and that the society contains enough appropriately gifted and adequately trained people to exercise these occupations. Peasants, that is, produce agricultural goods to nourish us. Shoemakers make shoes, physicians heal us when we are ill. These different occupations are assumed to be highly individuated and distinct the one from the other. And it's further assumed that they will be more efficiently exercised if they're performed exclusively by specialists. So the farmer is a better farmer if he is nothing but a farmer, and the best physician will be someone who is exclusively and nothing but a physician. This principle of exclusive division of labor turns out to be absolutely crucial for Plato's construction. He proceeds to use it as a basis for the social structure of his ideal city, adding to it the further and in fact highly implausible assumption that each person is born with an exclusive natural talent for some occupation. So the ideal city is one in which each person does exclusively that for which he is by nature and birth suited. So you can see there are different versions of this principle of division of labor. The most general sense is that there should be occupations. There should be such an occupation as the occupation of the farmer, and the farmer should be different from the occupation of the physician. The second idea is you're better if you don't just have functionally specific berufe, functionally specific professions, but if you have individual people who only exercise those professions. That's a further addition. Then the third thing is, it isn't just better if each person has their own single profession, but people are born with separate aptitudes. So it's a very strong version of the principle of division of labor that holds there. If one wonders why Plato's city, which is trumpeted as being especially rational, beautiful, and generally good, does not already exist, it seems so plausible and beautiful, why doesn't it exist? Plato has three reasons for that. First of all, there's no guarantee in nature that in each generation, enough people with the right kinds of natural talents will be born, so as to fill all the necessary occupations in the city. If that does in fact happen, it's a fortunate accident, but not one can count on. Sometimes there are simply not enough naturally gifted physicians available, and if this phenomenon is repeated on a large scale, it will be impossible for an ideal city either to be established or to maintain itself in existence. Second, although the Platonic principle of exclusive division of labor is perhaps rational, it's not self-evident. It would have to be discovered, recognized, and implemented. So people can simply and non-culpably be in ignorance of this fundamental truth. Plato's third reason for the non-existence of the ideal city is that up to now, no one has had both enough power and enough insight into the necessity of implementing the appropriate division of labor, actually to set up a whole city based on this principle. Our human situation is hopeless, famous thing Plato says, as long as we fail to give monarchical power to correctly trained philosophers, or until a powerful king is himself trained in the proper way as a Platonic philosopher. So the non-conjunction of power and knowledge is the third reason for the non-existence of this ideal city. Morus gives this Platonic construction a distinctly Christian turn. He thinks it's imperative, as Plato did, to distinguish true, invariable human needs from mere wishes or desires, or, as the phrase now goes, from preferences. Needs are different from preferences. They're not strong preferences, they're a different kind of thing. But he has a rather deeper explanation for why a potentially utopian state has not been realized. The reason for this is not mere accident or ignorance, but rather a positive form of human viciousness rooted in human nature. For Morus, it is superbia, pride or arrogance, which is a consequence of the Christian notion of original sin that brings our utopian impulses to naught. Now, pride has something like the structure of Nietzsche's pathos of distance. It is not, that is, that people wish to have their needs satisfied, even if the needs of others are not satisfied. Rather, it is the case that each individual wishes precisely to see and know that others go hungry while he eats his fill, so that he can feel superior to them and can take pleasure in their deprivation. That's what superbia is for him. Superbia means I'd rather see you starve than have enough to eat myself. Oddly enough, Morus seems to think that the abolition of private property could break down human pride so that it would die away if it has no chance to develop and express itself. But there are two difficulties with this position, namely, how is one to imagine the abolition of private property if it really is contrary to a deeply seated structural feature of human psychology and life? If pride really is deeply, deeply ingrained in human nature, won't it always find a way of establishing a regime of differences in the level of satisfaction of needs? This would be the case only if pride had to express itself in the realm of needs and not merely of desires. And if, in addition, human needs were relatively unplastic and static, so that once the basic needs were satisfied, no more arose. And neither of these two assumptions seems to be true. Second difficulty with Morus's position refers to the possibility that a utopian state could be realized, but that our judgments about any such given state, even if it were, but it's a difficulty with our judgments about such a state. Perhaps it's the case that a world in which everyone can satisfy their basic minimal needs is preferable to one in which some live in luxury whereas others starve. But what if the realization of utopian egalitarianism leads simply to a universalization of a state of misery? I'm referring here, of course, to that famous passage in the work of the early Marx, where he talks about crude communism, which you remember he says is the universalization of Elend, misery universalized, and he thinks this is the first stage of communism. What would we think about this if that turned out to be not just an accidental stage through which history passed, but were to be something that was rooted in human nature? That is, you could only satisfy everyone's need at the cost of having the level of satisfaction of needs being very low. If that were the case, a realized utopia might be a sad or tragic moral necessity, but it would not be an attractive image of human happiness. If, what is more, the human penchant for private ownership of property and the pathos of distance really could not be done away with or controlled by a few relatively harmless social mechanisms, then there will be need for a powerful apparatus of repression and control to maintain the utopian state of equality. The third sense of utopia was that of an ideally good society. But during the past century or so, people have become very aware of the possible ways in which precisely the striving for the ideally good can turn into the realization of something that is distinctly bad. And so they've taken one of the Greek words for bad, dys, and added it to the term topos, to form a term for an especially reprehensible society, dystopia. This term is used especially, as you know, for a society the evil of which arises precisely out of exaggerated attempts to realize the good. What would Morus have said to the two objections I've raised? Namely, that utopia is not, in fact, just non-existent, but is actually impossible, and that even if some proposed utopian project, which seemed to be attractive in simple discussion, were fully implemented, it would not turn out to be especially attractive. The dialogue form in which Utopia is written, and the fact that Morus is both the author of the work and a figure in the dialogue, allows him to play with the reader in a way that makes it slightly difficult to pin his position down. Neither Morus, the figure in the dialogue, nor Morus, the author of the dialogue, claim to have seen Utopia with their own eyes. One of the other figures in the dialogue, however, does make this claim. He, however, bears the name of Hythlodios, which means the person who says silly things. So the only one who's seen it is a man whose name is he who sees silly things. He who speaks silly things. On the other hand, so that's on the one side. On the other hand, Morus goes out of his way to emphasize that Hythlodios makes a strong impression of seriousness and reasonableness on all who come into contact with him, and that he, Morus, is inclined to believe him. If, furthermore, Morus had really thought that utopian institutions, such as the abolition of private property, really were impossible, he could have saved himself the effort of discussing the merits and disadvantages of such an arrangement at such great length. As far as the final evaluation of Utopia's social system is concerned, Morus is also oddly evasive. He says he wishes to reject some of what he's heard, but would like to see other features of Utopia introduced into his own society. The question, of course, is whether this is a coherent position at all. It would certainly not be coherent if one were to take seriously the claim that societies in general constitute totalities, so that one cannot simply pick and choose at random individual features that one finds desirable and expect them to have the same attractiveness in the new setting that they had in the old. If one considers the utopian projects of Moore and Plato in terms of their possible origins, one might think of them as representing, in particularly condensed distillation, tendencies we can see operative in our own lives, or particular intensifications of certain aspects of that life. We see that in many societies, members of the same family or even small groups of friends do not enforce strict ownership relations in their use of common resources, and we extrapolate from that to the possibility of an abolition of all property relations. There's something like this about isn't there an old institution called the Zadruga that used to exist here that had some common ownership of property, etc. So there's a kind of intensification of that. Intensification in the imagination, however, is not a kind of perversion. Rather, the striving for that which is completely and radically different, and which is also overwhelmingly better, is something one would expect from an entity like man who is endowed with reason and imagination. If you're endowed with reason and imagination, you can expect an entity endowed with those features not simply to register what is given, not just to process it, but also to generate in forms of intensification of it in imagination. And that can have all sorts of positive advantages for evolutionary advantages and other sorts of advantages. So if I realize I'm doomed to suffer massive systematic pain and degradation in my current situation, then it's natural that I form the idea that it's pointless to change some minor detail of my situation. But I might try to imagine a way of changing the whole structure that is oppressive. And it's then also comprehensible that I imagine that my world as a whole becomes significantly better. So that's a possible fifth characteristic of utopian thinking. That is intensification or exaggeration, that which goes beyond what we normally think and expect. As you know, this aspect is particularly emphasized by the German philosopher Ernst Bloch in various of his writings. Morus does not himself speak of exaggeration in the description of utopia, but he does characterize some of the arrangements on the island described by Hythlodaeus as absurd. We speak of something as absurd when we recognize that it contains elements that are in some sense disproportionate to each other, or with assumptions that we make which we take to be well-founded. Thus, Hythlodaeus says that in the absence of private property, the whole of the island of Utopia is like one big family. Contrary to this, some might agree with Aristotle that it's absurd to consider the whole of society as if it were simply a single family, because the realm of large-scale social and political affairs must be completely differently constituted and permitted to follow a completely different logic. A large-scale society must follow a logic of impersonal rules, and to this extent must be different from what might be appropriate inside a small family. And it's the clash of these two kinds of logic which constitutes the effect of absurdity. At the limit, one might imagine that the process of intensification and exaggeration comes to an end in a state of affairs that is not only good, or even very good, but actually perfect. That is, a state that could not be bettered, or even a state from which all deficiencies have been removed. That would be a purported sixth characteristic of utopian thinking. That is, that it's thinking about that which is not just good, but that which is perfect. As you probably know, some utopian authors, starting in the 19th century, even made a point of trying to show that the utopias they described were good, but were not perfect. That is to show that this idea that a utopia must be perfect is different from the idea that a utopia is good. For instance, in the novel by the late 19th century British designer, artist, and communist activist William Morris, News from Nowhere, he goes out of his way to portray the possible tensions and problems which remain in the communal society of the future, while insisting still that this society is better than that of Victorian Britain. The classic utopias, those of More and Plato, exhibit all six of the features that I've described in one way or another. But it need not be the case that all six of them coexist in the utopian project. The individual semantic components can, as it were, make themselves independent, the one from the other, as in News from Nowhere, and can develop further, each in its own direction. That's why I call this varieties of utopian thinking, because you see this conjunction of these six things, but you can see that they're not actually necessarily connected to each other. So you get a whole spectrum of different possibilities deriving from the way in which they made themselves independent, they developed independently, and then they perhaps rejoined to each other. So as a result of this, we can see a whole spectrum of possible forms of utopian thinking, each one resting on and perhaps even developing or slightly modifying one of these six elements. The exaggeration one finds in many utopian proposals is obviously part of the recurrent anti-utopian objection that utopias are per se unrealistic or impossible. And many people seem to assume that what is radically different from what we know must be impossible. Worthwhile utopian proposals will seem exaggerated because they'll be positioned on the very boundary of what turns out to be possible, without, to be sure, moving over that boundary. The difficulty, of course, is to know where that boundary lies, especially if one believes very strongly that the social imagination is to some extent dependent on the society one lives in. That is, if one thinks that the social imagination is dependent on the society one lives in, then the limit of what one can imagine as possible or impossible is not given independently of the society one lives in. That is, if one agrees with Hegel that no one can jump over his own shadow. Theoretical opponents of any form of utopianism, of course, have a vested interest in playing up the difficulties here. But they're actually sometimes helped by some of the proponents of utopia, who tend to give themselves a more heroic stature by describing the difficulties they face in an exaggerated way. Struggles between proponents and opponents of particular utopian projects are not merely intellectual agreements, usually. Given that exaggeration is a natural propensity of the human imagination, there's a sense in which some of these disagreements, there's a sense, it's not the whole sense, there's a sense in which some of these disagreements can also be seen as conflicts between two forms of imagination. On the one hand, one can paint the virtues of the proposed new society in the brightest of colors, while also denigrating in an exaggerated way the defects of the present. A dystopic description of the present will be more convincing the more closely it's connected with discernible trends in the present which move us towards something like the envisaged dystopian state. On the other hand, one can keep pointing out the possibilities of reform in the present and loudly warn against the possibility that any given utopian project will have distinctly dystopian results. There are, of course, sober opponents of utopia who consider themselves to be particularly mature and conscientious, and who would never intentionally play utopian and dystopian fantasies off against each other. Many of these people are guided by a well-thought-out methodological principle about the order in which we should proceed in practical affairs. We should strictly, they think, proceed by distinguishing between what is possible and what is unrealistic before embarking on the process of deciding what we wish to do. That's the methodological principle. First you decide what's possible and not, then you decide what you want. It's tacitly assumed that the distinction between these two things, the possible and the impossible, can be made on purely cognitive grounds by purely cognitive means, without any participation of any of our desiderative, optative, or voluntative faculties. If human wishes, fears, desires, or hopes have any influence on the formation of our views about what is possible, we have, these people argue, a case of wishful thinking, and thus an instance of gross irrationality. If we do not first delineate the realm of that which is realistically good, on purely cognitively good, which is a realistic goal of aspiration, on purely cognitive grounds, we'll find ourselves unable to make a rational decision about how we should act. Of course, viciously wishful thinking exists, and it's important to avoid it. But the question is whether it's possible to imagine cases in which our will and desires interact with our judgments about what is possible and not possible, where this interaction is not vicious. There is such a thing as that which is objectively impossible, things excluded by the laws of nature and the laws of logic, perhaps. One might argue that since what is at issue here is precisely what's possible in concrete cases, not in abstract discussions, it would be a mistake to be too dogmatic about what is or is not objectively possible, as if we knew that in advance. It isn't only the case that there must be a distinction between the possible and the impossible, it's also the case that for this line of argument to go through, that we have to know, be able to know with relative certainty what is possible and what's not possible. But in a great many human contexts, the distinction between what's possible and what is not so clearly visible, or certainly not so visible before one acts. Obviously, what is concretely possible at any given time and place depends on the technological means effectively at one's disposal. These are highly variable in time, and how they develop is unpredictable. Arguments based on natural necessity that might have had some force in undermining utopian projects in the 16th century don't seem as convincing to us in an era in which we've become accustomed to expect virtually continual technological progress. Why cut back our wishes and hopes to fit a current level of technological development if that level is likely to be outdated next year? One can, as it were, turn Popper's view about the inherent unpredictability of future scientific results against his anti-utopianism. However, the question of what is possible in a human context depends not just on technology, but also on what one can expect from other people, what we can expect people to tolerate, to be able to accommodate themselves to, and perhaps even to welcome. Who is prepared to pay what price in order to realize what goals? That's the form political questions generally take. For the long-range future of the environment, it would certainly be beneficial if everyone in Europe immediately shifted to a wholly vegetarian diet, because as you know, raising cattle causes more increase in the temperature of the environment than using cars. So if we all became vegetarian, we would plant soybeans instead of fodder. We wouldn't have all these cows around, and so it would certainly be better. Such a shift is not technologically impossible, but can one realistically expect people to accept a change of that kind in a basic feature of their relation to the world? Might one even demand that they do that? Could one, even in principle, implement such a decision? And at what other cost? Finally, there are options that become visible only when they're antecedently chosen on non-rational grounds. And one might even want to claim that there are options that become possible only if they are pursued with a certain unreflective persistence. If there are cases like this, one automatically excludes them from consideration if one adopts the pure cognition first approach, which I've viewed. This does not mean that faith actually can move mountains. It doesn't mean that. Or that willing alone is enough. But that one cannot even see certain possibilities unless one is antecedently, in some sense, committed to them. There are some possibilities like that. Of course, this also does not imply a value judgment, either positive or negative, about the actual options one might choose if one rejects the cognition-first approach. And it does not even begin to enter into a discussion of phenomena like fanaticism. But nevertheless, it remains the case that there might well be options that are only visible if you're antecedently committed to them. As you know, this is a standard argument in certain forms of religious discourse. You can only see the truth if you're antecedently committed to it. And, whatever you might think about that in religious context, as a general argument, it seems right. Still, I think the above gives us some reason to keep our distance from the model of purely cognitive sobriety, and to reject the view that there's some deep and principled reason to deny that our volitions and desires can play any legitimate role in distinguishing what is possible from what is not possible. In fact, I'd like to suggest that one of the positive functions of utopian thinking is precisely to investigate in what way wishing, hoping, and desiring can interact with knowing. This, I think, is part of the reason why Adorno is always so keen to claim that exaggeration is an essential part of the cognitive process. In fact, it's possible to imagine that this thesis is no more than a slightly modernized and developed version of motifs that will be familiar to all philosophers from Plato. Plato believed we can know the world only to the extent to which we can relate it to a structure, sense, or meaning that is not itself perceivable, a set of ideas. He realized that these ideas had to contain a kind of semantic surplus or excess. They never simply mirrored directly what we actually encounter. No real circle actually is a perfect circle. The idea of a circle always contains more. Plato interpreted the ideas ontologically, but if one drops this ontological reading, it seems natural to think that these ideas are constructs of the imagination formed by intensifying and exaggerating certain common features we might encounter in the world around us. Plato's error would be to assume that such constructs existed prior to human cognition rather than being internal components of it, as if circle or cat as determinate fixed entities had a preternatural existence before we began investigating them. Freeing oneself from this error would mean rehabilitating the imagination and hence also exaggeration as elements of a healthy cognitive process. A realist, to be sure, in the sense in which that highly ambiguous term is sometimes used, is committed to analyzing the relations of power in the world in which we live. However, power itself is not an observation predicate like green or soft, but it's something that is recognized and described only as at the end of a long investigation, which will necessarily have cognitive moments which will not be the mere registering of given data. In particular, utopian constructions often form the necessary background against which alone certain forms of power relations become visible. All practical thinking, if one wants to be strict about it, is wishful thinking to some extent. There's no alternative to this. I used to fail to see this, but I don't fail to see that anymore. There's no alternative to this. One cannot completely repress. It isn't I failed. Well, anyway. One cannot completely repress. We can't completely repress our structure of desiring, nor can we completely disconnect it from the other parts of our apparatus for knowing the world and making our way around in it. The best we can do is reflect on this fact in general, and in every particular instance we can, as fully as we can, and subject our wishes and desires to as careful and continuous a form of reflective scrutiny as possible. So neither exaggeration nor wishful thinking is in itself irrational. To think they are is to start from a highly distorted conception of rationality. The point is to treat these volitional and desiderative elements as an integral part of some process of rational decision, not to try to exclude them. Now, I know this sounds like an extremely lame statement, because I haven't said, nor can I say exactly, what it means to treat something as an integral part of a rational decision process. Clearly, you'd have to say something about that. It's easy to say, it's not very informative. I'd be perfectly in sympathy with you if you were to say that to me. But in fact, and that's true, I suspect, in fact, though, that it's no accident that I cannot give you what you want here, namely something like a universal algorithm. Part of the point is that nothing like such an algorithm can exist. Decision processes are too strongly context dependent. Of course, one might disagree with this on any number of grounds, but it is, I think, important to see that from the fact that no absolutely general substantive rules can be formulated, it does not follow that what you have is mere chaos. The utopian image of unchanging perfection, that is a picture of a society in which everything is optimally arranged once and for all, is one that has power over the human imagination. Perfect, as already mentioned, presumably means in every aspect unsurpassably good. At the latest, though, in the Romantic period, some philosophers came to realize that not all clearly valuable and desirable human properties complemented each other, nor were they even compatible. Some excluded others that were, in their own way, equally good. The example given by one of the early Romantics, I think it's Teak, in a novel he wrote called William Lovell, but I'm not completely sure. It's one of the early Romantics. He gives the example of a blacksmith who actually wants to be a person who paints miniatures. But being a good blacksmith in the early 19th century is something very good, but it requires particularly strong hands and such strong hands are not necessarily ideally suited to the delicate movements that a miniaturist must execute. You can't necessarily be a good tennis player and a good pianist or a good violinist. The two might be good in themselves, but they might be incompatible. Older utopians like Plato and Morus were unfamiliar with the idea of continuous technological progress, but they assume, as if it were obvious, that human needs are fixed and unchanging. What happens then when people begin, as they did in the 19th century, to realize that human needs too are changeable and have a history? Or to hold, as Marx and Engels did, that the increasing development of human needs was one of the motors of history. What was impossible becomes possible. What was a luxury item becomes a necessity. Engels' example, you remember, is the railways. At the end of the 18th century, at the end of the 17th century, they were still unthinkable, impossible. Then they were a luxury. Then, by the end of the 19th century, he says, they have become a necessity, a human need without the satisfaction of which human life is hardly imaginable. And as we know, in societies in which railway systems develop and become a necessary part of life, this necessity causes further human needs of different kinds to develop. The idea of historically developing needs is incompatible with an image of an unchanging, steady-state society, even a perfect one. So it would seem appropriate to say goodbye to the ideal of a society that has attained a stable state of perfection. One advantage of this is that utopian thinking can then become hypothetical rather than apodictic. One can stop taking anything like a possible literal truth, the literary fiction of an author who purportedly surveys a society at rest and takes it all in. The viewpoint of the colonial master or the old-style ethnographer was in any case a construction, and in both cases much could be gained by reflecting on the political conditions under which it was possible to maintain or invent this construction. I'd suggest that the skeptical and perspectival Montaigne is a better model for hypothetical utopian thinking than More or Plato. One of the main ways in which ideologies operate in our societies is by declaring that certain things are impossible, that are in no way actually impossible, but rather merely not in the interest of those with power. When former British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher and those following her said there was no alternative, as she said repeatedly, no alternative to her preferred economic arrangements, this statement would require the closest possible scrutiny. What it really meant was that she and people like her, if they were to retain their powers and privileges, there was no alternative to her preferred version of capitalism. To allow one to look critically at the purported necessities of a given society is one of the most important functions utopian thinking can serve. A utopia, I'm almost finished. A utopia is a contribution to a literary genre, not a blueprint, and it ought not to be understood as one. That utopian proposals cannot be directly implemented or even directly acted on is not necessarily an objection to them. Morus himself speaks at one point of an indirect mode of proceeding. He talks about the obliquus ductus as an alternative to direct action. Now, to be sure, his own suggestions about this, about what the indirect procedure might be, are highly unsatisfactory. They don't seem to go much further other than the rather weak advice to be ready to compromise on occasions when one cannot get one's own way. When the prince, Morus says, is not prepared to follow the optimal advice, the counselor must be flexible enough to try at any rate to prevent the worst from occurring. This doesn't get one very far, but at least it does indicate an awareness that direct action is not the be-all and end-all of human life. It probably is the case that thought in complete abstraction from action is not very sensible, but it doesn't follow from that connection that the connection between thought and action must be direct. It must be in the form of each thought being connected with a particular action. The connection can be more mediated and more general and more indirect than that. So utopia, okay, so this doesn't, of course, thought is connected to action, but to try to reduce this connection to problem solving of individual problems, is itself an instance of an impoverished understanding of our human cognitive, moral, and political capacities. So utopia should not be identified with giving a description of a purportedly perfect society. And utopian thinking need not be understood as necessarily a set of injunctions for immediate action. Utopianism can have a variety of other functions, such as throwing light on connections that might otherwise escape notice, providing ideal types that can stimulate further thinking, and serving as a source for useful hypotheses. Fertility, suggestiveness, and stimulation are, however, not categories of immediate action. To put it another way, a utopia is not an answer, but it's a question directed to the reader, suggesting that the reader reflect on things such as the socially recognized limits of what is possible, the consequences and conditions of what we desire, and the mutability of our needs. Why in our society can we buy or sell anything? And why do we expect that there are no limits to our technological possibilities, while at the same time we're told to treat our existing social, economic, and political system as sacred and untouchable? Why should there be no alternative in economics, but infinite alternatives in the market and infinite alternatives in technological progress? Many people are acquainted with the utopian aspiration for something completely different, even if they do not, at the moment, see how anything different could be created. A form of thinking that closes off this dimension of human existence for dogmatic reasons, I must say, as certain forms of analytic philosophy tend to do, is not particularly responsible, sober, and mature, but deeply deficient. Thank you.